we talked about the church calendar and the way that some of those dates evolved from away from the Jewish calendar and away from the Roman calendar and into what we more now kind of understand as the general calendar from which we're all operating. But there's actually an aspect of the calendar that does not have to do with Roman Christianity. And in it, you really see the enduring impact of the Germanic barbarians. And that it's important to understand as we look to the Aryan German barbarian Christianity is where we're starting on the notes, that there had been missionaries to the pagan tribes in Europe, really ever since Christianity had become the dominant government-sponsored religion in the Roman Empire. So, you know, if you think of Constantine and you think of like the Council of Nicaea in 325, in that era is when people started saying, you know, we need to go out to the other populations that live here, just as the first generation of apostles came from Jerusalem to the Roman world. Now it's our turn, and we need to go out to these other population centers, these places where there are masses of people that have not heard of Christianity, and we need to tell them about it so that they can become Christians. And we talked just a little bit about Ulfilas that in the fall session, that he was the person in the early 300s, in the early 4th century. Let me see. Oh, there's the dates. So he was born in 311, lived to 383. And he became a translator from the Greek and Latin into the language of the Germanic tribal. Of course, they were all a little different, but he kind of standardized it. Ulfilas actually helped the barbarians create an alphabet and a written language for the purposes, from his side, for the purpose of translating the Gospels and the New Testament texts into those vernacular languages for those tribal or barbarian people. Barbarian is sort of a Roman perspective put down. So we might say indigenous peoples or tribal peoples or whatever. And he had a place to start because the Gothic cult, which is what we're really talking about, had a 3-person arrangement of gods. Now, you can kind of equate them to the Roman gods. So there was like a god of war, and there was the goddess of the sun. And so one of the ways in which they translated was to say, okay, so your god of war is going to be like Mars or Ares, the one that we understand from Roman culture. But that doesn't include Christianity, right? That's just a sort of one-on-one from the Roman paganism to the Germanic paganism. But it made sense to a lot of people. That was how especially the barbarians could identify with Rome. They could see themselves as participating in Roman culture because they could say, oh, we have the same gods. In much the same way that the Greeks and the Romans came to believe that they had a unified culture because they could make identifications between the Greek gods and the Roman gods, right? So that was happening at the same time that the missionaries and the people who were more committed to Christianity than they were to the Roman Empire per se, were trying to talk to these people about Christianity. So their message was, okay, well, you guys already understand the Trinity because you have these three gods. And so that is going to help you understand how God the Creator and Jesus and the Holy Spirit are all the same in some way, even though they're different. But those gods were Tu or Twi and Wotan and Thor. So how do they remain in our calendar? Anybody have a thought? Turn on your speaker. Yeah, Ruth.
Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday.
Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday.
Right, exactly. So the days of the week ended up with the Germanic divine names. And I don't know why. I mean, we obviously Sunday and Monday or Moon Day are other god figures, but they're also planets now. And Saturday as well as Saturn's Day. And these other gods were the Germanic gods that were associated with the planets. And so you can see that, for instance, Wotan is the god of Mercury. And you can still hear in the French, for instance, which is Mercredi, is Wednesday, is the Mercury day. And Mardi, which is Tuesday, is Mars Day, which is the god of war, which we have Tuesday, which is the Tu, who was associated with the god of war. So depending on which Romance language you speak, you've got various different connections. It's all the same planet, it's all the same god figure. The question is, what were you calling it in that culture when the day names got set in stone? So there was influence both directions, is what I'm wanting you to hear. That the Romans and the Christians had an impact on the Germanic cultures, and the Germanic cultures had a certain impact on the Roman culture, particularly as Rome began to decline and fall apart, and the Germanic powers and forms of governance kind of, to some extent, came in to fill the vacuum. However, the Christianity that then became indigenous to those tribes, the way that they integrated it into their society, would come to be different from the way in which it was going to evolve in the hierarchical church that still had its reference to Rome and Roman culture, and even more to the Eastern tradition and to those major cities that had always been influential in making decisions about what literature was going to be in the canon and how the various different theological dilemmas were going to be resolved. So there's going to be this tension from the word go, almost, between the indigenous Christianity, which did originally come from missionaries from Rome, but then it kind of took on a life of its own in the Germanic culture, in the Frankish culture, which is the French, we now think of that, and in the culture in Britain as well. So everywhere that the Roman soldiers went, everywhere that there were outposts of Roman authority, there grew up a kind of native-based Christianity, which was always different from what I think of as sort of the expat Christianity of the Roman soldiers themselves. So if you think about, like, say the chapel on the military base in Germany, right? That for the American soldiers who are there, its services are conducted in English, and it's more like being in an American church than it is like being in a German Christian church. So there may be not only different languages, but there may be different practices, there may be different cultures, there may even be different beliefs between that expatriate community of people who just happen to be living in Germany versus the people who are actually German and incorporating Christianity or whatever religion into their culture. Does that make sense, the difference between those two things? So eventually the Roman soldiers are going to leave. They start being withdrawn right around the beginning of the 400s, right around the beginning of the 5th century. And by the time that Odoacer deposes the Western emperor in 467, that process is pretty much complete. There's not much foreign military presence left going on with the Roman Empire. So there's a good 6 decades or so in there, or maybe even as much of as a century from the time it started out, for divergence to happen, for the indigenous interpretations of Christianity to evolve in different directions from the way that the Roman Church is evolving. And as you may recall, some of those early missionaries were quite avowed Arians, right? They were people who had not been invested in the controversy about the Trinity and were not committed to what it came out with in the end. And so a lot of the indigenous Christianity that the Roman missionaries are going to confront as the church begins to grow and spread its control, its authority, is going to be Arian Christianity. The first thing they're going to have to do is try and stomp that out. And of course, they are never entirely successful. And our existence as a religious heritage is testimony to their lack of success, because we are the heirs of the undefeated Arians, right? Okay, so they also, whereas the Roman Church, in conversation with the Eastern Church, I mean, they're now sort of increasingly two different things as they're going to evolve separately, but they were having a very philosophical and intellectual argument about the nature of the Trinity. They were talking about, well, how can something have one essence but two persons, or those kinds of very thought-based understandings of what's going on there. For the Germanic pagans in particular, they saw it as very organic. They said, okay, you're talking about a father and a son. We understand that. We get that it's a family relationship kind of thing. And they were much less interested in the philosophical definitions and the intellectual distinctions. So that they had a much more organic, sort of nature-based, like, okay, we get it. A tree has roots and a trunk and branches, but they're all the tree. Those were the kinds of images that they used to understand the Trinity, as opposed to aspects of the mind, shall we say. So the Roman Christians tended to think of them all as Arians. They didn't necessarily make distinctions among the different tribal groups or among the different, I mean, you can't really call them national because they weren't nations at that time, but we think of them today as the French or the Germans or the British, those groups. The Romans kind of lumped them all together, and as if no longer heathens, then perhaps heretics, and people who had an unapproved or uncanonical version of Christianity that needed to be corrected. Another thing that they did, partly as part of the heritage of Ulfilas, was that he had taught and educated people about the documents of the New Testament, about the literature of Christianity in their vernacular languages. And so they tended to use their vernacular languages for everything except the most formal liturgical, the sort of magic words in the Eucharist, for instance, in the Mass, or in the formula of baptism, or whatever. Those kind of the statements that really made it happen. This is my body, this is my blood, that kind of thing. Those they might do in Latin. And they understood that because they understood the idea of magical language, that there are certain kinds of formula and you have to say them correctly. They have to be pronounced right in order to work their magic. But for everything else, for preaching and discussing and teaching and so on, they were using their own vernacular languages, which is what the Romans were doing originally, of course, when they were doing stuff in Latin, right? Because that was the language they spoke. But as the church solidified and also expanded, that more and more the hierarchy and the authority was focused on those who used Latin. And so Latin became the formal language and the official language of the church, such that if you were going to become a bishop, if you were going to become a priest, one of the things you would have to do is to speak Latin. That was part of the qualification. So gradually, as there begins to be a push from the heathen Christian communities, the formerly heathen Christian communities, of we want our people to be bishops, we want our people to be cardinals, we want our people to rise, in the formal church power structure. Well, then they are going to have to move away from those vernacular languages, their native languages, and they're going to have to operate in a Latin speaking environment. And that is going to differentiate the people who are connected with the power of the official church from the believers, from the religious community. And that distinction is going to become a barrier. It's going to become, if you speak Latin, oh, then you're on their side, kind of. But yet you can't get into being a priest. You can't get into being part of the church structure unless you speak Latin. So it's kind of a dilemma for those. And then how do you teach? How do you bring other people into the community of the church? Do you do that in the language that they understand best, or do you try to urge them to become conversant in the correct language, in the language of the church? And you kind of see that today a little bit in Islam, where the question is, do you need to learn Arabic in order to read the Quran? Because some people would say, everything else is just an interpretation. If you really are gonna get the full impact of what the Quran teaches, you have to know it and be able to read it and understand it in the original language. Otherwise, you haven't really learned what it is to be a Muslim. And other people saying, if I have to learn to speak Arabic, I'm never going to be a Muslim, because that isn't going to happen. And so, do you want me or not, kind of thing. So there's that tension is not just an artifact of this age. It's something we have in our own culture. Another interesting thing about the tribal Christianity, perhaps is a good way to say it, is that it was not city-based. It was not urban in the same way that the Roman version of Christianity was concentrated in the cities. And we've seen that the big power centers, Alexandria, Antioch, Jerusalem, Rome, Constantinople, it was very influenced by the cities, and the power structure in the church was very interwoven with the political power structure in those cities. So that if the governor of the city didn't like the bishop and exiled them, then you had to get a new bishop. You know, or if the population of the city rose up against a particular preacher or a person in the church, then they were kind of finished. You know, the concentration of population in the urban centers made certain kinds of control useful and other kinds of control not very useful. That it wasn't the same in the tribal cultures. They didn't have those big cities. So you couldn't just say, okay, we're going to build this big church in the middle of this big city, and it will almost inevitably, by definition, become important. You know, it just the sheer number of people and resources of wealth and so on that are available there will make it important. That didn't happen. But what did happen was a kind of patronage that if you got a tribal chieftain or someone who had access to a lot of resources or a lot of wealth, they could basically build a church. If you had the money to build a church, then it was your church and you got to pick your own priest and your own bishop. And so there was more of a sense of whoever came up with the building could essentially staff it themselves. It was their family business, kind of. Oh, okay. And so that made the idea of a bishop much less persuasive and much less powerful, as opposed to the secular authority of the chief or whoever the wealthy person was that could afford to sponsor a church and a church organization. And so therefore, those folks, as you might imagine, were resistant to the bishops of the urban areas of Rome, particularly, as not taking them seriously, you know, not respecting their position, not willing to grant them the authority to pick their own, you know, church functionaries or make their own decision about how they were going to celebrate a particular ritual or how they were going to furnish the church that they were building, or all of those things that went into determining how Christianity was going to be practiced in that particular area. Does that make sense? Okay. All right. Chime in here if something goes by too fast or you have questions. The other big difference between and I think this is fascinating. I love this. We've seen in the what I'm calling the Roman tradition, but the classical tradition, the tradition that came out of Jerusalem and became the Christianity of the urban centers, that there was originally a sense that to demonstrate the depth and passion of your Christianity, the first thing you could do was be a martyr, right? Early on, before Christianity was accepted, if you were really faithful, if you were really serious about this, you got arrested by the Roman authorities and you got, you know, you might have your property taken away. You know, you might be sent to Rome, most likely. I mean, you might be executed locally, but it was more likely that you would be sent to Rome. But and that whatever suffering was involved in that, you embraced it because it was your opportunity to prove your fidelity to the tradition, right? It was your way of affirming the power of God, that you went through this martyrdom, whatever it was. And so the first saints were those people, the people who had been willing to suffer martyrdom as a way of demonstrating the quality of their faith, right? Well, what happens when Constantine says, ollie, ollie, income free, everybody's going to be a Christian now? The opportunity for martyrdom basically disappears, right? There is no longer that path to demonstrate that you are, in fact, a passionate Christian. So the next thing that happens, and we saw a little bit of this in the fall, is the rise of monasticism. All right, well, I can't be a martyr, but I can go out and live in the desert, and do nothing. And that we saw a bit of this beginning in the Jewish tradition, with the Essenes going out and becoming a pure community to await the arrival of the Messiah. So early on, when people were still waiting for the return of Jesus, like the literal physical return of Jesus anytime now, it made sense to some people to say, I don't want to be mixed up in the commercial society. I don't want to be, worried about how I'm going to be married off by my family. None of that matters to me. I'm going to go out in the desert and eat locusts and wait for Jesus, right? And that became the way of proving the seriousness of your commitment to this faith. And so the next are the monastics, the people who go out and they, stand on pillars for years on end, and they do all these bizarre forms of mortification that in some ways echo the sufferings of the martyrs, for the same reason, to prove that they're serious. And then the next way that you become a saint is you decide that you are so serious about Christianity and seeing other people being saved that you are going to go become a missionary. You are going to take Christianity to the furthest outpost you can find where it's never been heard of. And you are going to spend your life converting those people, those pagans, those heathens, those folks that have never heard of this. And, if you, in fact, traveled a very long distance and a lot of times to a very risky kind of situation because you didn't know how you were going to be received in that culture, and they might perfectly well decide that they didn't want to hear it and off with your head kind of thing. That was another way of proving you were serious, and that was another way of becoming a saint, right? So the evolving Roman church had this notion of the saint was an individual who has in some extraordinary way demonstrated the quality of their faith, right? And that will not be how the heathen Christians understand sainthood. What they are going to understand sainthood is as a way of translating their idea of nature spirits, their idea of minor gods and goddesses. We see this particularly, we remember it with Bridget, in the British Isles, that this goddess of wells and candles and all those things, we're going to talk about her in a couple of weeks in church, that she becomes Saint Bridget. She becomes one in the calendar of saints who has a day to be honored, and she gets some sort of story about the quality of her Christianity. But these are not necessarily martyrs. These are not necessarily people who have made any kind of witness to Christianity. What they are is more nearly magical helpers. They are people you can turn to, like, Saint Anthony if you've lost your glasses, or the saint who's going to help you find a parking place, or, the saint who's going to keep your biscuits from burning in the oven or whatever. So there's a sense of, yeah, this is a Christian saint, but I'm still going to, bring flowers to her shrine, or I'm still going to do these kinds of things that would have been very familiar in a heathen culture to propitiate the spirits, to get on the good side of the local semi-deities. So it's easy to make them into Christian saints, but this is a whole different way of understanding what a saint is than the way in which the Roman Church understood it. Does that make sense? And we're going to have kind of a conflation of that as Christianity becomes more of a worldwide faith, that saints become both of those things. They become figures that can be appealed to for divine/magical aid, and they also become people usually with backstories about how they suffered for their faith, right? So you want to have both of those things to really qualify. But for the tribal people, it was much more a question of, are they useful? Can we appeal to them and get help from them, rather than do they inspire us with what they were willing to endure, in order to prove their Christianity. Okay. Everybody still with me here? Okay. No questions. I must be doing a great job. Yes, Carol.
So at what time period does it switch over and become Latin? I was not real sure.
It is by nature Latin in the first couple of centuries, when Christianity comes to Rome. Well, when Christianity comes to Rome, Christianity is largely Greek, right? I mean, that's the language that people are speaking around the empire. But coming to Rome, it gets translated into the vernacular language of Rome, which is Latin. And then people start writing the stories of Christianity and translating the Gospels. Remember, that's what Jerome was doing in his cave outside of Bethlehem. He was translating the Greek scriptures into Latin. So it's a process of acculturation to the Roman Empire, that everything has to be in Latin, because that's how the Romans are used to communicating with each other. But then the people who are missionaries from the Latin church start going out into these other communities where they have to talk with people in the languages that those people understand. But if they're writing a report back to Rome, of course, they're writing in Latin, because that's the language that the people that they're writing back to are going to understand. And when they bring the formulas, the baptismal formula is a good example. Those magic words are going to be in Latin, because that's how the missionary learned them. And that's what makes them efficacious. That's what makes them work. So you're going to use that Latin as the almost magical formal language of the church. But if you're talking about, how are we going to build this building, or, let's get some new candles, or, telling a story about Jesus or one of the saints, that you're going to do in the language that people understand. Right. So when the first missionary comes from Rome, right? They were ordained in Rome. They were made an official part of the church in Rome. The kid that grows up under their influence out in the middle of, Germania somewhere, is who's going to say, I love this stuff. This Christianity is great. I want to do what you do. Well, the first thing that they're going to have to do in order to become like the missionary is to go back to Rome and get educated and get ordained. That's only going to happen if they speak Latin, right? They can't go be educated for the priesthood while they're still speaking whatever it was, Proto-German or whatever they were speaking at that point. So eventually the understanding grows up that the church, the official language of the church is Latin, because that's what everybody speaks. And it was also because the outlying Christians spoke lots of different languages. So Latin was also important because it was the unifying language of the church. If you showed up for a church council, wherever you were coming, whether you were coming from Egypt or you were coming from Turkey or you were coming from Italy, it didn't matter, you were expected to speak Latin. So, and that's how they all understood each other. So it wasn't just arrogance, it was also practicality. But so eventually the idea was you could not speak with authority on behalf of the church unless you were speaking Latin. And so the more you wanted to participate in that, the greater the pressure for you to speak Latin. And I think there's always a sense in what less evolved cultures that any language that isn't the language that the majority of people speak is kind of magical, you know, that it has a certain, it has a weird power, right? Because it communicates to some people, but not to others. And so there's that mystical piece of it. And the church was perfectly happy to have its language have a mystical power. You know, that was okay with them. So it doesn't suddenly become Latin. It's always been Latin. It's just that now Latin is in a context where it is not the language that everybody's speaking. It's the language that only the church is speaking. Does that help?
Yeah. And as an aside, when did Latin die? I mean, for most Italians and become Italian.
Well, that is a great question, and I'm not enough of a scholar of linguistics to know, other than that I would say in Vatican City, they would tell you it has not in fact died. So, you know, in terms of the language of the church, it really wasn't until the Vatican II that they started doing mass, you know, in the vernacular languages of the society in which the church was located. That was a huge innovation within our lifetimes, right? So Latin was the church language for a long time. I mean, my husband spent some time learning the Latin Mass in order to be an altar boy. And just about the time he got qualified, they changed it. And he was so mad he I spent all this time learning this stuff, and now you're telling me I don't have to know it? Nuts to this. Yeah. So that's a very recent change. And there, you know, it is not universally loved or accepted, because you can still find parishes that, you know, advertise that they offer the Latin Mass, you know, as part of their ministry at some point. Yeah, Ruth, go ahead, and then I'll go to Sarah Ann.
Okay, I'm sorry. There's a difference even in how it should be pronounced by singers, because the singers usually, if they're doing sacred music, will use liturgical Latin.
Right, there you go.
It is not, in some instances, the same as classical Latin. Right. And the truth is, classical Latin has died out. Because it's what the Romans spoke back when. Right. So there's always a lot of discussion about which form of Latin are we going to use here. And another thing is, in a lot of churches still will have a whole service in each weekend in Latin for the old timers who like the magical quality of it. Exactly. And then they have the others in the dialect of whatever city we're in.
Exactly. Peggy, I'll come to you after Sarah Ann. Let me just say first that one of the drivers of the Renaissance is going to be the difference between liturgical Latin and the Latin of classical literature. So keep keep a pin in that because we'll come back to it in a couple months. Sarah Ann.
I was forced, I was going to a private Catholic girls' school, Ursuline, and so I was forced to take 4 years of Latin in high school.
Mm-hmm.
And I kept saying, why? And the answer was, it's just required. So,
Well, that's not helpful.
No, so I just want to share that.
Sure, right. I mean, there are some good arguments for studying Latin, but that's not one of them. So you didn't find it particularly satisfying as a pursuit in itself?
No.
Yeah, it was not fun.
The only thing it has given me, because I also have studied French and German and a little bit of Spanish, is that when I come across English words that are very unusual, I can kind of break down the meaning of them.
All right. That is one of the arguments for studying Latin, is it gives you a basis for Romance languages. But anyway, Peggy.
Let me just throw on top of that, I thought studying Latin, and then I've also had a couple of years of Greek, were extremely important. It's one of the best things I ever did. And I don't think I understood the English language until I studied Latin and Greek. But that wasn't what I was going to say. I was going to, going back to the question about when did it become Italian, it's a slow process because medieval Latin is completely different from classical Latin.
Right, right.
And I think that was a slow process of medieval Latin slowly turning into what we now call Italian. Right. So it's the same language, really. Yeah, and I guess when you're talking about liturgical Latin, you mean the classical Rome. It's like they locked it off at one point.
Right.
This is Latin, because it makes it more sort of timeless and mysterious, right? As opposed to what people are now talking, which is changing. But medieval Latin is, very different, and don't assume you can read medieval Latin if you studied the classical.
Yeah, right, exactly.
The same with modern Greek and all the different kinds of early Greek. They're pretty much different languages.
Right. And okay, yeah.
Well, I was just going to add that one of my best friends in high school had gone to Notre Dame de Sion for what we call junior high, and it had Latin there. And then she tried to transfer Latin to Latin in a public school. And she was furious. Her attitude was much like your husband's. It was, this is an entirely different language. What are you people talking about? She said they pronounced everything differently than the nuns did. And I thought she was going to stroke out before she got to high school. It was tough on her.
Oh, yeah, right. Well, I think you can sort of hear this a little bit. If you think about the most traditional wording of the wedding ceremony, for instance, and you think about people saying, with all my worldly goods I thee endow, and thereto I plight thee my troth. Nobody says anything like that in actual English in use anymore. But we have kind of preserved that formal speech, that particular statement, and it is exactly what people would have naturally said 500 years ago, or whenever those rituals were assembled. But language has evolved. But when it has that kind of formal purpose, it doesn't evolve. Or like when the judge walks into a courtroom and the whatever the guy is says, "Oyez, oyez, draw near and you will be heard." I mean, who talks like that? Nobody talks like that. But somebody did, centuries ago. And so those formulas remain even when the informal language moves on. And so that's part of what happens with the liturgical Latin is you want to hear it the same way you heard it yesterday and the same way you heard it 10 years ago. You know, and you don't want someone saying "what's up" in the middle of the mass, you know, that it doesn't feel right. And so that's how you get these it's just like, you know, we think of a nun's habit, for instance, as being this very strange way of dressing, but all it is the most simple, most common, cheapest way for a woman to dress respectably back in the Middle Ages. You know, it wasn't meant to be special. It wasn't meant to stand out. It would be like jeans and a t-shirt today. But if someone decided that jeans and a t-shirt were a uniform and kept wearing them for 200 years, you know, then they would be a very unusual thing to see someone wearing by the time you got to 200 years from now. So it's a matter of usage and what gets preserved and what is allowed to evolve, shall we say. So the language becomes a piece of what makes the church stand apart from the culture, and what makes it inaccessible to the common people. And that's going to play a role in how it becomes the power that it becomes. Yeah, Anna.
I was wondering, Sue, did you want to say something? Because you had your hand up and you didn't say.
Well, go ahead. No,
Okay. I was just
I didn't see.
I was
Okay.
just going to say that you were talking about just what you were just talking about, but it also was how the original church was happy with this whole it's sort of a magical language, it's exclusive, and
Right.
it's, you know, at going to church as a kid and having not really grown up in church, just going to my grandmother's Lutheran church, there were parts of church that I understood in English, you know, and then there were those parts with the thee, thou, thou'st, and all this stuff. And as a kid, you're translating figuratively, like, is this something I'm supposed to understand? Like, is this a different language? Is this? And so when you leave, you learn that this building is a place that things happen that don't happen outside this building. And so it's special. And only special people understand what's happening here. And it sort of drives you to choose whether you're going to be one of those people or not. It's like a little incentive to become one of them, you know? And I understand that, you know, like that's why my dad would have wanted to be the altar boy and learn the things to say. So he was in on the secret.
Right.
And that makes sense. So it still happens in some churches. You know?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think it's a mistake to see it as just the church imposing this, because I think we all want that. You know, we want to be part of the club with the secret handshake, and we want to be part of the inside group. And maybe we don't want to be part of this inside group, but there's some inside group we'd like to be part of. And it all has to do with that sense of there's something special that I know. And I mean, I think you see that in QAnon. You know, I mean, I'm one of the people that speaks this language and understands this reality, and most other people don't. And those of us who do are special. So I think it's driven by both sides, you know, by the institution saying, hey, this works for us. And by the people who say, we want to be part of that inside circle.
Humans,
yeah.
Humans are the only animal that has the ability for magical thinking. No other animal can have imagination or anything like that. Humans, we all do have that magical thinking in some ways.
That is a very long conversation I would love to have, but it's a rabbit hole we are not going to go down right now. But there is, magical thinking is a particular reality all of its own. I agree with that. Now I see a hand. Dave, is that you? No, that's my computer. Okay, all right. Anybody else want to? Yeah, Sue.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that the evolution of Latin to Italian was is crazy. And, first of all, people in Italy were separated by lots of mountains and various things and different cultures. And so when Italian evolved, there were a million literally ways to speak Italian. And when Italians came to Ellis Island, many of them couldn't talk to each other.
Oh, interesting.
So it's and anybody, I haven't studied languages, but anybody who does knows it's probably true in many cultures. I know in Mexico it is, but you can't really say when Italian arrived.
Right. Well, I mean, you have to keep in mind there was no such thing as Italy until the 1800s, right? I mean, Margaret Fuller was over there when the revolution was happening and Italy was gelling as a nation. And it's surrounded by all of these, it's got the Greeks on the one side and the French on the other, and the, Turkish on the other. And so, there was no coherent, there was no coherent France, there was no coherent Germany, there was no coherent England. None of those places existed. But Italy in particular had no national coherence during this time or at any time up until, the modern era, basically. So why would there have been Italian as a language? That there would have been no country, Italy, for it to be the language of. Basically, you had city-states, you had Florence and you had Padua and you had the Papal States, as we'll talk about in a minute. And this is an interesting question. I'll have to see if I can find out. I'm guessing that maybe the Papal States hung on to classical Latin longer than many of the other political entities. And I can find out about that. Interesting. Okay, so after the fall, the deposition of the last Western Roman emperor, which we all remember was 467. That's one of those dates we want to kind of engrave in the neural pathways there. The year before that happened, a guy named Clovis was born among the Frankish tribes in the area that we would now call France. And he would come to be known as the Western Constantine, which is to say that he himself would convert. He grew up as a Gothic pagan or heathen. He would convert to Roman Christianity. He would convert to the Christianity represented by the Bishop of Rome in 496 or 498. It depends on which historian you believe, but I'm opting for 496 basically. And in much the same circumstances as Constantine, because he was up against a military challenge and he wanted some divine aid. And so it was suggested to him that perhaps the Christian God could do this for him. And so he sort of said, okay, Christian God, show me what you got. And in fact, he won the battle against the Germans, the Alemanni, and then said, okay, fine, then I'm going to be a Christian because this is obviously the most powerful guy. And so when he was crowned as the local king after that battle, he was also anointed at his baptism. So he gets baptized and then he gets crowned king. And part of the baptismal ritual is this anointing, but it got conflated also with his coronation. So that after that, the tradition arose that European kings were anointed by a representative of the church, of the Roman Catholic Church, as part of their coronation ritual. And so the church begins to claim that anointing as something that is in their power to give or withhold as a validation of that, the divine recognition of that kingship, that this person is in fact intended by God to be king. And so therefore the church anoints them, and therefore they have divine as well as secular political authority. Right, so that starts with Clovis, just at the beginning of the 6th century. So there are kind of, well, 4 actually, but 3 that I want to talk about now, genres, if you will, or typologies. One of which is the Germanic or Gothic indigenous Christianity of the area that we now know as Germany. There's the Frankish, the area that we now know as France, and then there's the British on those British Isles, which had at one time a significant Roman presence. And so that there was those early Roman soldiers, and not just soldiers, but also colonists, because one of the things that the British did was when they took over, not only did they send garrisons of soldiers, but they would send people who were in search of land. Much like the American colonists did. They'd send folks out and say, this area is great for growing grapes, so why don't you go found a vineyard? And so those Roman citizens would go and they would take over property in these colonial places. And they would, of course, bring their religions as well as their cultural customs with them. And so the original early Christianity of the British Isles was the expatriate Roman soldiers and Roman colonists that brought that there. But then they left at the beginning of the 5th century or the middle of the 4th century. And then you start to get the missionaries from the Roman Church coming to bring the official Christianity, the authoritative institutional Christianity, if you will. And those include the very traditional, almost mythological figures of people like Saint Ninian in Scotland and Saint Patrick in Ireland, which may actually be in the same way that King Arthur is probably a combination of several historical figures mythologized. It seems possible that that's true also of Saint Patrick and perhaps even Saint Ninian in the Scottish tradition, that these are figures composed of stories about various different people who were existed around the same time and had some of the same interests or agendas. So what happens in the British Isles is that as soon as the Roman troops withdraw, you get these invasions, as those of us who've studied our English history remember, of the Angles and the Saxons, from whence Anglo-Saxon, right? As well as the Jutes. And so there is something of a renaissance or a new rise in Germanic paganism that follows the withdrawal of the Romans, the original Romans. And that contributes to the rise of what we think of now as Celtic Christianity, that has elements of the Irish and the Scottish as well as the British. And it has some distinguishing characteristics that are going to cause conflict when the missionaries from Rome start to arrive to tell them the right way to do Christianity, because they've already got their own way of doing Christianity. And it is much more focused on monasticism and on monks as missionaries. See, Rome is sending out priests as missionaries. Rome wants people to go out and found churches. But what is happening to some extent on the continent, but even more significantly in the British Isles, is the rise of a kind of independent monasticism. So that if you want to be a serious Christian, what you do is you participate in the foundation of an abbey or a monastery. And you can do that as a layperson. You can be a patron of that establishment, and you will have certain privileges there. People there will pray for you. People there might take care of you in your old age. But there are ways of being connected to the life of a monastery without necessarily yourself becoming a monk that would motivate you to support that enterprise, to want there to be one in your community or more. So then those communities of monks, who are not as beholden to the hierarchical authority of the Roman Church, they tended to be the local people who were sending out missionaries to other local communities. And what they would do then is set up more monasteries. Because setting up a monastery originally didn't take as much investment as building a church. Because all you needed for the monastery was a couple huts, for the monks to live together, and eventually they'll be quite wealthy, but not at the beginning. Yeah.
When they set up the monasteries, do they import the monks or do
No.
local people end up being the monks?
Right.
So they have to learn Latin.
Not initially.
Oh.
Initially these are much the same way that we saw in Egypt and in the Middle East, where monasticism also arose, the Desert Fathers originally. These are people who want to take their Christianity seriously. Now they're not motivated in the Egyptian, a lot of the original Egyptian monks, monastics, were motivated by the idea that Jesus's return was imminent, right? So they were going out in the desert just to be away from everything and wait for Jesus to come. That's not so. By the time you get 400 years later, most people have given up on that, right? They may have it in the back of their mind somewhere, but it's not something that they're necessarily committed to is going to happen in their lifetime. But these are people who, for one thing, they're reading the Gospels, and this is always going to create a tension. They're reading the Gospels and the Acts of the Apostles, and they're saying, here's what the early Christian community looked like, right, according to these accounts. We want to have that. We want to have that living together, that sense of being a community that is trying to live out the new life in Christ rather than the old secular life. So that we're going to get together and do that in community. And the model for that became the monastic life. And one of the things that we didn't talk about, and I've been listening to a fascinating series of tapes, is the huge tension or controversy right after the time of Paul in the apocryphal literature about the importance of celibacy. Because there was one strand of the tradition that was just like, no Christian should ever have sex, basically. And the superior life, the new life in Christ was always a life that did not involve impure things like bodies, right? Basically, they lost the argument. If they'll come back and win it about priests, but in terms of the whole Christian community, they lost that argument, because communities where that faction wins tend to die out, surprisingly. But there is that piece of the teaching, and it's always appealing to a certain group of people who for reasons of their own would rather not mess with the whole marriage, sex, children, it's all very distracting kind of thing. So there was that piece. And the Celtic Christians took that really seriously. Wait a minute, where did I go? Okay, yes. That becomes more the focus in terms of how do you practice Christianity? You practice Christianity by becoming a monk or by supporting a monastery, more than by building a church or supporting a priest. Now there are priests, but they're kind of functionaries of the monasteries. I mean, the priest exists in order to say mass on behalf of the monks. That's kind of the priest's job, as well as whoever else wants to have mass said. But the place where that's going to happen in a regular, orderly kind of way is going to be in the monastery. And the monastery is going to be concerned with sending out monks who have already committed to lives of service and poverty and so on to other communities to try and do the same kind of thing there. There was also the idea that travel on behalf of Christianity was a virtue, was a spiritual practice, that it was a sign of your devotion to God that you were willing to leave the comfort of your home community and the stability of your home community and go out as the disciples were sent out. In the New Testament, you have these instructions, don't take supplies, don't worry, just go and talk to people about this whole Jesus thing. That's in the New Testament. And so they took that seriously. Whereas the church, the institutional Roman church, is always going to be a little bit suspicious of people who are not settled, of people who want to just wander around kind of being mendicant Christian ambassadors, so to speak. That is not going to be something that they're real crazy about, because you don't control those people. They don't need you in the same way. But that was a for the Celtic Christians, that was a feature, not a bug. If you wanted to go out wandering and spread the word, kind of. So therefore, the people who had the most power were not the priests or the bishops who represented churches, but the abbots, the people who were in charge of the monasteries, the people who came to be leaders in those institutions, who had authority over the monks. Those were the people who made the decisions that needed to be made on behalf of Christian belief and practice and discipline. It was much more likely to be the abbot that you were going to consult for those kinds of decisions than it was the local priest. Yeah, Kay.
Why? Why did people trust the abbots and not the priests? Or why did they go to them? Why did they give them power? Or who did? I don't understand.
Well, I mean, the abbots, and once again, think back to the emergence of the bishops, when the bishops were more or less elected, right, by popular vote. Okay. in the big cities, right? I mean, you had the church authorities, you had the civil authorities, and you had the people, and you kind of had to get a consensus among those three groups in order for a bishop to be successful, right? The same kind of thing is happening in the abbey, in that the monks are not going to stay if someone tries to be the abbot that they don't respect and they're not going to obey, right? And if the abbot is, let's say, very indulgent with the monks, but very demanding of the common people, then they're going to stop supporting the abbey, which means that it's going to be very hard times for the monks and the abbot. So, that kind of unpopularity is bad also. So the abbot really has to be a politician, right? I mean, they have to be able to persuade both their lay supporters as well as the monks who are constituting that particular monastery. They have to be a good financial manager, because of course there's never as much money as you'd like to have, right, to support this whole proposition. But they're the ones who can do something for you. I mean, they're the ones who can give you a place to stay if you're on the road. That was one of the things that monasteries did, which partly had to do with their supporting the concept of the wandering Christian, you know, the person who just goes out to spread the word. Well, anyone like that is going to be welcome to stay at our place if they're on the road, right? And there aren't such things as you know, Marriott hotels. So having a safe place to be if you're traveling, that's a huge benefit. Or you know, a place for your you know, mentally challenged son to have a place to live and be cared for. Or you know, like I said, you in your old age. Or you know, where the girl that's managed to keep her pregnancy secret is going to leave her baby once it's born. Or, I mean, there's a whole host of social functions that the monastery is providing. And so the person who can coordinate that and make all that happen is the person that you're going to go to when you need some sort of, you know, assistance, or, you know, you have a thing that you want decided or whatever. And the priest, if the priest is basically serving the abbey, you know, if their livelihood comes from being supported by the structure of the abbey, then the priest is also going to be bound by what the abbot decides, right? So it's organic, you know, it's not top down. It was very much bottom up, grassroots, and which is why there's going to be conflict when the Roman hierarchical structure comes in and says, okay, now here's how we run things, where's your bishop? You know, people are going to say, nah, we don't think so. And so that's why there's going to be some struggle between those two groups. Does that help in terms of what's going on there?
Yeah, I couldn't believe that the bishops would let this survive, but I see you're saying that they really tried, but they just couldn't get a toehold at first.
Right. Well, you know, the bishops were coming from elsewhere.
Yeah.
And, you know, early, because there wasn't time for the hierarchical church to get established in the British Isles before Rome pulled its forces, right? So all they did was they left behind a kind of popular Christianity that had been spread by the soldiers and the colonists, but not the structure. I mean, they didn't have the urban centers. They didn't have there was nothing about Britain that would have attracted a Roman bishop, right? I mean, it's like when the Anglican Church had trouble getting ordained priests to go to the colonies, you know, to come to America. And so the Anglican Church really struggled to be led in the colonies until they started ordaining their own American priests, right? Because anybody from London thought, you know, that this was the back of beyond. Well, same thing with the Roman bishops. You know, why would you want to be sent to England? That would be like if you really screwed up and they wanted to get rid of you. So the ways in which the sort of mass of people were organizing themselves as Christians were very different from the way in which the church in its sort of most official capacity thought that things should be organized.
So the church, the official church, left a vacuum there that the
Right,
monks
That's
were
right.
more than happy to fill.
right, exactly, exactly. All right, let's see here, what else? Okay, another thing is that the Romans had been used to the idea that when the head of the household, when the pater familias converted to Christianity, then his family was considered Christian. That made sense to them. Religious identity in the tribal culture, and even Britain was more tribal. It was really a tribal function. You know, if the tribal leaders converted, then kind of the tribe converted. But also there was the expectation that the tribal leaders were then, by definition, the church leaders, because that's how it worked in the tribal heathen culture. You know, you had your chief was a little bit magic, and the chief might be related to or have a hand in picking the shaman or the wise person or the holy magical person who was going to do trances and spells on behalf of the tribe. So the way in which those tribal groups negotiated how they were going to become Christian and who were going to be their leaders in Christianity was very foreign to the way that the Roman church was used to negotiating those same kinds of questions. And they didn't really get the whole tribal thing. Again, just like with the Germanic tribes, that the formal liturgy was in Latin, because that's how the formal liturgy was in the early expatriate Christian community. But the teaching and the preaching and the conduct of religious life tended to be in Gaelic, tended to be in the indigenous languages that those folks were speaking. And so again, you know, you begin to get literature, particularly with the British, not so much that I'm aware of with the Germanic or Gothic, but they were less literate. The British tribes, I think, were already had a written language even before they encountered Christianity. You begin to get a literature, a Celtic Christian literature that grows up without regard to the synods and the conferences that are happening in Constantinople or Nicaea or wherever to say, you know, is this letter dogmatically correct? You know, should it be included in the canon? Should it be read in church? Who knows what those crazy people in the British Isles are reading in their masses, you know, or in their how they're orienting newcomers. You know, what are they teaching the people who are learning the catechism and so on? It might not be very connected at all to what's happening on the continent, let alone what's happening in Rome. The communication, it's hard for us to even imagine how difficult and time consuming and expensive it was to try to create any kind of doctrinal consistency over those kinds of distances and language differences and cultural limitations. It just was almost impossible. The other thing that is going to evolve interestingly in the Celtic tradition is the idea of penance. And if you remember, we talked about, and I'll tell you about this and then we'll end for today. We talked about people like Constantine, for instance, put off being baptized until he was almost dead because he didn't want to have any opportunity to commit any sins once he was baptized. He wanted to be sure that, you know, that was going to be it, and then he would be sure of going to heaven, right? And that, you know, the problem with that is you can miscalculate, you know, about how soon you're likely to die, right? So if you go ahead and be baptized as a sign, like Clovis, for instance, that you have in fact converted to Christianity, then if there's a space of like several decades between that and when you die, what are the chances that you've done something in that period of time that could be considered sinful? Particularly if you are a military leader or a political figure where you're, somebody's going to call what you're doing sinful, no matter what. So what do you do about that? And the church had begun to develop this tradition of what was called penance. But in the early Roman church, it's a one-shot deal. Basically, it's all right, you go ahead and be baptized whenever you're ready. And then when you're getting ready to die, you do this act of penance. And that clears away everything that may have accumulated between your baptism and your death. But it's not something that you can do over and over again. It's like baptism. You do it once and then it's done. So again, you got to get your timing right. But it's also a public thing. You do it as a way of publicly confessing that you have sinned and that you need forgiveness and that God is going to do this for you and get you into the kingdom of heaven. Penance in the Celtic tradition evolved as something that was repeatable and private. So it is more nearly when we think of confession today, you go in the little closet with the priest and this is a weekly thing or a monthly thing or a seasonal thing, however often you do it, then the priest says, all right, here's your penance. These are the things we want you to say, these prayers, or fast for this many days or whatever. But the expectation is you're going to be back, in 6 months or next week or whenever it is, and you will do this act again, and it will again be efficacious. It will clear away your sin whenever you might do it. And you don't have to get up in front of everybody in the congregation and say, this is what I've done. You just say it to the priest, and it's between you and God and the priest. And that model would come to prevail in the church as a whole over time. But it was one of the things that, again, created tension between the Roman church when they started to say, hey, you guys need to be under the same umbrella with the rest of us, and the indigenous Christians within the Celtic tradition. So part of what I want you to hear here is that we think of Roman Catholicism as this kind of monolithic thing that's the same everywhere for everybody. And it never has been. It wasn't at the beginning. It will never be that. It's not that now. It always wanted to be. That was the ambition of the Roman church, is we're the ones in charge. We get to decide how this is done everywhere it's done. And it's done in the language we understand, and we get to select the people and all that. But there's always going to be communities of resistance to that. There's always going to be other ways of looking at the tradition and other sources of authority than the institutional church. So I think you can't understand some of the pushiness, if you will, the self-assertion of the Roman church without understanding some of these forces that were constantly pushing back and would have liked to assert themselves, and in some cases did. Yeah, Anna.
Well, I don't know that it was conscious, but it's a smart model. If you're going to try to include more and more different areas, conquer or convert or whatever the word is, you're bound to run into new ideas and ways to translate both literally and figuratively. And if you're able to roll with it and tell a story that works, you're going to succeed. I mean, it's kind of genius, really.
To the extent that they were willing for it to happen, it served them. Yeah. But, you know, I think Rome is always, Rome's agenda is always, how little of this can we get away with?
Of course.
Right. But yeah, you know, I mean, if you try to come in and say, you know, nobody will ever, you know, leave flowers for the river spirit again, you know, the first time there's a flood, you're done. But if you say, oh, you must really be talking about Saint Winifred, and yeah, we'll leave flowers for Saint Winifred. Okay, she's the, you know, the patron saint of streams or wells or whatever. Then you can bring people in without trying to take away something that they're going to miss. And then the question becomes, how much do they get to decide, and how much do you get to decide as the, you know, the big church, the official. Yeah, Peggy. You need to turn on your mic there.
Yeah, I don't know a lot about this, but it seems like the church behaved in a very different way when they came to the New World, and the way they interacted with the people, like the Aztecs and Incas, where they tried to really strongly suppress the local deities, and had a very different experience. But interestingly, the people themselves did the purging of the forms. Yeah, so it's an interesting,
you almost can't avoid it. You know, when you have a coherent culture that you're trying to come into, you're going to be integrated, you know, sort of willy-nilly kind of thing. But yes, they were quite violent about it in that conquistador kind of mode. But they didn't have, the church did not have the military and governmental resources in the 5th and 6th centuries that they would have in the 15th.
Would it also have been racist?
Of course, partly, yeah, because I mean, this is a fascinating question. I might be wrong, but I don't know of any discussions about whether the Celts, for instance, were or were not human. But there are quite serious discussions about whether the Africans or Native Americans are human, in the sense of having souls, and in the sense of having the possibility of being saved, of actually being part of the kingdom of God.
Well, I think the Aztecs were a bit more shocking than the Celts, when they showed them the temple with the walls dripping in blood. I mean, a little too much. It was a little much for pretty much anybody at that point.
Well, right. I mean, yes, and I wouldn't necessarily want to be an advocate for all aspects of the Aztec culture. But I think, and one must make allowances for a genuine kind of shock and aesthetic revulsion, but I think it's fairly safe to say that most of what the church objected to was the worship of demons, you know, as they would have called it. And they were perfectly happy to do some pretty horrific things themselves in response. So, but we will get there. We'll talk about that maybe next fall. All right. Any other questions or thoughts? Otherwise, we will pick up with the popes next time.